Hey everybody, it's Tony Robbins. We got a very special podcast today with a very special friend, somebody I know you all respect and love. But the subject we're going to talk about is focus, power, the mind. Hey, listen, you know this is part of my life, right? Because the mind and the heart, I wouldn't leave the mind without the heart, otherwise you're just in your head, right? Get in your head, you're dead. But the ability to focus, to concentrate, to learn, to grow, to expand, it is what really makes life worth living. It's what gives you the tools to make a difference, to grow your business, to be a great parent, to be a great friend, to be a great business person. And yet there's something that can mess with it. And it's probably one of the larger fears we have. And no, it's not COVID. We're not going to talk about that. You've heard enough about that for the day, the week, the month, and maybe the year. But it's something that has longer term effects in most cases. And that's dementia and Alzheimer's. And so I want to talk to you about solutions. I want you to understand what the challenges are. And I thought, who better to do that than one of the most respected and beloved doctors in the world. He's a neurosurgeon. He's an Emmy-winning broadcaster, a journalist. He's a man that gone to Iraq and operates on people. He is a Renaissance man, and I'm a giant fan of him, have been for a decade and a half, and that's Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay, thanks for joining us, Dr. Gupta.
Tony, what a pleasure. One of the things I like to say the most about myself is I'm an FOT, friend of Tony. I really cherish our friendship. I do. Thank you for having me.
I've just got done reading his new book that I recommend all of you go get here. It's called Keep Sharp. Build a brain, a better brain at any age. It's really like a 12-week action plan. That's what I love about it. It isn't just cognitive understanding, but here's what you can do to improve that. Not only to avoid the problem, but to strengthen yourself right now. And so I want to start out, Sanjay, you really are that Renaissance man I talked about. That's not blowing smoke. And I'm curious, before we begin on your book, to know a little bit about your journey. I mean, I think about 15 years ago or so, we met for the first time. I did an interview with you. And I remember afterwards, you gave me a few minutes and I was so interested in you as a person. You just had one of your daughters. And if I remember right, I think you told me, I'm interested in what shapes people. And, here you have this incredibly broad background. I want to know how that journey began and what influenced you. Correct me if I'm wrong. If a long time ago, I think you said your mom was one of the first female engineers, if I remember, in India, or maybe the first here in America at Ford, yes, where your parents met. Is that true? And what role did she play? And can you take us, how do you go from neurosurgeon to one of the most respected medical, people on television and shaping, people around the world and what they think and what they understand about how to take care of themselves?
Well, you're very kind to sort of portray it that way. It's interesting. We all have these sorts of journeys, and sometimes we don't get a chance to reflect on it like this. But one thing I do want to say, though, my mom, I think, for a lot of people, their parents do have this influence on them that maybe they recognize even more so later in life.
Yes.
She was the first woman ever hired as an engineer at the Ford Motor Company.
Wow.
And which was incredible, really. I mean, they just didn't have women engineers at that time. And it was, to just tell you a funny story, she goes there, she's determined. My mom is one of these people. She's determined, Tony. You would love her. She never says no. She just doesn't give up. Anyways, she's cold calling. This is in the mid 60s in Dearborn, Michigan, home of Ford. She's wearing a full sari and it's winter time. I'm just painting a picture for you, and they're not used to seeing a sari, let alone an Indian woman, let alone someone who wants to be an engineer. And she's cold calling and eventually, gets these meetings and they say, look, we don't have any engineers here that are women. And my mom says, and if you don't hire me, you never will. So that was the line that kind of, so that you talk about shaping people, that I remember that line my whole life. But the other thing, and you'll get a kick out of this, my mom's name is Damayanti. That it's a long name. And so they immediately said, you have to shorten your name. They told her she had to have a nickname, which, is just weird to even say that. But regardless, that's what they told her. She thought quickly and she said, okay, it's going to be Rani, which means queen in Hindi. So she basically said, if you're going to make me change my name, you will call me Queen for the rest of my professional life. So that's my mom. It's almost like enough said, right, in terms of what shapes you. But she I think that's a big part of it. I also think a lot of people, maybe you as well, Tony, my parents sacrificed a lot for me. They made a lot of sacrifices, in order for me to get a good education. And it was not easy for them. My mom lived as a refugee for part of her life, all that. I do feel like there is a desire to just do as much as you can as a result, almost just do things. So sometimes there's not even something that really ties it all together. I got a little time here on earth. I've been given this great gift of great parents, and let me just do as much as I can.
Yeah.
That's really the journey.
Well, you've been hungry, like to learn and grow. I'll tell you another thing I really respect about you. I've never used drugs. I'm not a prude. It's just I grew up in a family where drugs were abused and alcohol was abused. So, my associations are pretty intense against it. But I saw you talk about medical marijuana, and I think you won an Emmy, if I saw, for your series where you said, hey, I was wrong. There's new insight. There's new science. Today, that's one of the biggest difficulties we have. We have a lot of science that contradicts each other, and today it's only one voice. Like COVID is a perfect example. Like people are equally qualified. They're taking off social media and so forth today, but you have a different attitude. You have this attitude of like, I just want to bring what's right. Where does that come from? And how did you make that journey of shifting, for example, on something that you felt so strongly against, and then you felt it really does make a difference in certain situations, especially with brain issues?
Well, I think with regard to the COVID, and again, I appreciate you portraying it this way, Tony. I mean, these are difficult times, no question, and you're right. I mean, you talk about the clashes between science and policy, and
Yeah.
and the economy and all that. These are real clashes. People will write about this historically for hundreds of years to come. So, what I think, I don't think society has enough honest brokers, to be perfectly candid with you.
Yeah.
I think there's too many people for whatever reason, and this isn't a criticism as much as an observation. There's too many conflicts. People are they're just conflicted,
Yeah.
and it's again. I'm not saying it as a criticism, but you have to acknowledge it. I do think, and I'm biased, but I would think that journalists have a little bit of an honest broker role in here.
Yes.
What did I do? I'm not. I made a point of not being beholden to anyone or anything. I don't have, any kind of secondary gain issues or anything. I do a lot of homework. I'm reading the science all the time. I mean, during COVID, I woke up at 4:30 every morning for 14 months, including the weekend, so I could talk to my counterparts in China and Taiwan and understand what was happening there.
Wow.
And then I'm talking to patients and scientists here and vaccine makers and policymakers. You feel like you got to get a master's degree in it. And I think that's the hunger, but that translates as a journalist into something that I think is a pure, well-informed product. So a lot of people do that. I'm not the only one, but I'm saying that's kind of how I approach it. With the marijuana thing, I'll just tell you, this kind of dovetails nicely into it, because I did not see a lot of good evidence supporting medical marijuana. I wrote a Time magazine story about this 2009 timeframe, I think.
Yeah.
And what I realized, Tony, as I started to dig into it a few years later, was that if you were to just go look at all the literature on medical marijuana on our big literature sites in medicine, you would find, just at a macro level, 94% of the studies were designed to look for harm, 6% to look for benefit. My point is that 94% of the studies were being funded to look for a problem. And only 6% of the studies were being funded to look for a benefit. Already, the system was so askew. So it depends how deep you want to go when you look at these things. What I realized is when I looked at labs that weren't dependent on federal funding, labs in other countries like Israel, a different picture started to emerge. And it took me 18 months of just doing my homework to sort of arrive at this. Wait a second. We have not been getting the full picture here because no one ever really wanted us to get the full picture here. Here is a fuller picture, at least, and it shows something very different.
Yeah. I was moved by it changed my complete perspective. A, because I have so much respect in you, but I don't think blindly, even with somebody I respect, right? I want to read and understand. But you did such a beautiful job of bringing the human emotion to it to show real patience and what's really going on. And I think, I've always said that people, like something like war is overwhelming, something happening in Bosnia. But if you follow one family, then all of a sudden it's not so overwhelming. People can see and feel and experience it. I just thought, I'm so glad you won an Emmy for it. You deserved it. I thought you did an amazing job and completely changed my perspective on it. And it's like certain people I've recommended they're having problems with the children's area to at least look at this and do the homework on it. Whereas before I would have thought it's absurd. So I really appreciate that intellectual honesty that not only you have with the world, but you first have with yourself. It's unfortunately a rare quality today. So thank you for that.
People are fearful of saying that they're wrong. I mean, this is something you've talked about and written about. I mean, it can be a paralyzing thing. And I mean, we do live in a culture where if you say you're wrong, then people will, pounce on you and criticize you and maybe you. And Feel like, to some extent, you feel like, have I lost trust if I admit that I'm wrong? I don't know. I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I will tell you that the the tip of the spear has to be just total transparency. I mean,
agree.
God, I sleep so well at night, Tony. I'll show you my sleep. I sleep like a baby because I put it out there. I'm honest.
Yes. Let's talk about your book. What made you decide to write, keep sharp, excuse me, but also keep sharp is keep smart to me. That's what I want as well. But you did it in the middle of COVID. And tell us a little bit about the journey. Why'd you write it? And, how did you originally plan to have it come out this time? Did people really see it? Because, so much of our world is tied to the right now.
Yeah.
And here's something that affects people a lot more than COVID, a lot more people, and for a much longer time affects families. And yet I don't know if everybody's paying attention in the middle of COVID, but that's one of the reasons I want to spotlight this. I'm only one person, but we'll get 1 million or 2 people to look at this, and they'll tell other people. And I know you don't just need us. You got plenty of exposure, more than I've got. But tell me about the journey of why you wrote it, and tell me how people are responding in the middle of COVID to this. Are they paying attention? Because it does affect families so deeply.
Yeah. Well, I got to let you in on a little secret.
Okay.
And you'll appreciate this, but I wrote this book before COVID.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense.
And we were going to release it in the spring. I think it was March of 2020.
Got it.
And, it was just one of these times where there was 2 things that were going on. One is that I was, as I just described earlier, very, very focused on COVID at this point. So releasing a book on a totally different topic, it just toggling my mental sort of bandwidth. I just didn't think I could be as authentic in both areas.
Yes.
The other thing is that it just, will people read this? As you say, the urgency of COVID, will people read a book on a totally different topic? What we decided to do then was release it at the beginning of 2021, in part because we said, look, there has been a significant mental sort of impact of this disease on society as a whole, not just people who are afflicted with the virus. So maybe this will be of help. And we released it. And I think, I think people have found it helpful in that regard, but it was a little challenging to figure that timing out. Again, something that I think you appreciate.
Yeah, of course.
Tony, what I tried to do here, and this is a inflection point, I think, in life, because I've been straddling these 2 worlds of being a journalist, and I still practice neurosurgery.
Yes.
That is still sort of my first love, if you will. I think I identify most with my colleagues who are doctors. I go to the neuroscience meetings, I do all these things, and I'm learning all these things in that world that aren't necessarily totally translatable to my other world. Yeah. But every now and then there are things that I learn in the neuroscience world, and I say, that is so interesting. And yet 99% of the world doesn't really know about it yet. Isn't this what I'm supposed to do? Aren't I supposed to be a translator of this kind of information? And so, I'll tell you just briefly, one of the things that was coming out in the neuroscience community, which I thought was revelatory, was that you could build new brain cells at any age of your life.
Yes.
We used to think you got a certain number.
That's right. There's no neuroplasticity before the 90s, right?
No neuroplasticity before, but even the idea, so neuroplasticity, harnessing existing brain cells to do different things.
Oh, but you're saying making new brain cells.
New brain cells. You used to think that you would drain the cache, that was it. Alcohol would accelerate that decreasing of neurons. And now we learn that you can grow new brain cells at any age. We thought you did it when you were a baby, like your 3-week-old, building lots of new brain cells, or you did it after a brain injury, like a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. But the fact that a healthy brain at any age could grow new brain cells. So you're essentially saying you have an organ in the body, which happens to be your brain, which can continuously actually lay down new brain cells and have all the benefits of that, being sharper, being happier, being more productive, everything as you get older, which I thought was just really inspiring.
As long as you make demands, is that correct?
Yes.
Anything else, right? If you don't make the demand, then there's no reason, there's no need. Is that true?
There is a use it or lose it phenomenon, but we are learning so much more about what that means, right? Because I think we have a tendency to I'm going to do, 10 crossword puzzles, and that's my use it or lose it thing. And that can be great. But when I learned about how the brain actually grows these new brain cells and what that means, it made me reflect more on how I actually keep my brain optimized. I do it totally differently now.
Well, let's dig in. How about, what are 3 of the biggest things that you could share that make the difference between a toxic brain and a healthy, strong, fit brain?
One thing I just want to define a little bit is that healthy brain thing, because I think a healthy brain, I really found this interesting, Tony. People define this in different ways. A healthy brain, a healthy heart. So every time it pumps the chamber, it pushes so much blood out.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
easy,
a healthy
easy
heart
to measure. Yeah,
the pump. You can imagine that. What is a healthy brain? And some people will say, what's a brain that's doesn't, devoid of mental illness and things like that. People have all these different definitions. This evolutionary biologist I spoke to said a healthy brain is a brain that has a wide circle of view. That's what he said. And I was like, what? Explain that to me. And he said, the more and more people that you are truly willing to let in to your circle is evidence of a healthy brain.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Right? When you're a not healthy brain, you get very insular.
Yeah.
Really, maybe just you and Sage, healthier brain, all of us. And it's really interesting because you can start to say, well, that's empathy. But no, that's more than empathy. That's actually creating a group of people who are your sort of tribe. These are people who you swap ideas with. These are people who are intellectually stimulating. They have all these purposes. So the wider circle of you is a healthy brain. And I really like that because again, we don't know how to measure a healthy brain otherwise. I can measure your cholesterol, right, or your blood pressure, but a healthy brain, a wide circle of view. So a couple things I would just tell you, and some of this is I think changing your perspective a little bit, but some of it's like really specific. We use our brains kind of like we live our COVID lives right now. You're probably primarily at home. Maybe you go to the kids' school, grocery store, a few places, and you got that down pat.
Right.
That's kind of our brains. We use our whole brains, but we use 10% of our brains 90% of the time. Okay. Yeah. What a healthy brain is basically starting to use other parts of the brain to kind of, if your brain, that 90% of the time you're spending is your city, this is about visiting other cities, creating new cities and things like that. So when you're doing things that you do over and over again, crossword puzzles, playing the piano, whatever, those are great things. That's like driving in your city really well. Like you got this, I can get to these points, no problem, my eyes closed. When you start to do things that are very different, get you out of your comfort zone a little bit, that's when you're starting to really stimulate this process of neurogenesis, which we didn't even know you could do until recently. So here you got now new cities that you're essentially constructing in your brain. And that is a joyous experience. Yeah. That is a place that literally and figuratively expands the circle of you. So what does that mean? It could mean something as simple as tonight when you have dinner, Tony, I want you to eat your dinner with your non-dominant hand. Okay. If you're right-handed, I want you to eat your entire dinner with your left hand.
Yes.
Now I know that sounds silly.
No, it doesn't. I understand. You're creating new pathways.
You're creating new pathways. You're laying down new brain cells and you're making new roads. If the road that you know so well, Tony, in your city gets blocked one day, what are you going to do? You don't know these other roads. You haven't built them. So your road is great until it gets blocked. And then all of a sudden, cognitive dysfunction, memory loss, smaller circle of view. If you've built like 20 roads around that road, no problem. You still get to your destination. It's like how we think of the heart. Blood vessel's got a blockage. You bypass it. I'm being a little bit simplistic, but it's the same sort of thing.
Oh, it's really helpful for people to understand. I think it's very clear.
So do something different. And the crossword puzzles, practice makes perfect, but it is change that builds resilience. I think that's the key. Use your non-dominant hand, take up a new hobby, whatever it may be. My wife started painting with her non-dominant hand.
Wow.
It does a pretty good job, by the way. So this is a skill that we didn't know she had. So.
And other skills that you've never tried, learning a language, singing, other things that you might enjoy, but that will cause you to use a whole different aspect of your brain.
I learned how to play the ukulele.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Cool. My wife knows how to play the ukulele. They taught her in school in Canada.
Right. It's me and the Canadians playing the ukulele. But I would have never in my life thought I'd play the ukulele. It's kind of I take the guitar or something or the piano. Ukulele, because it was so different. And you're a Sage, your wife knows it is really different.
Yeah.
People who think it's just a guitar but smaller. No, it's a whole different strumming pattern. So I did it because it was totally different. It involved my motor cortex. I think hobbies that you pick up that do involve your hands, painting, pottery, some sort of instrument. It was great. I used to play an accordion when I was a kid. I brought my accordion out again and started playing the accordion. Who plays an accordion anymore? It's me and a bunch of Italian waiters, so it's, but you don't think of these things as being intellectually stimulating activities necessarily.
Yeah.
But the fact that I learn things because I want to grow new brain cells. I play the ukulele because I want to grow new brain cells. It's a different way of thinking, Tony.
And does it, in my experience, but I don't know if it's just me, maybe I'm wired because I love learning so much, but is there some link to dopamine or anything of that nature that comes from creating these new pathways or mastering something new? Or is that something completely different?
When I talk to these neuroscientists about the impact of creating these new pathways, they didn't so much talk to me about whether there was a objective dopamine release. What they described, though, was an ability to see patterns that you'd otherwise miss.
Yes.
Connect dots that you would otherwise miss. Like,
yes.
I got this. Oh, wait, because I've been building these new pathways, I can connect these two dots.
Yes.
And they brought it up in a way, Tony, that suggested that's a very joyous experience. Yeah. When you connect a pattern, you got it. That's how this goes together. Yeah. Is that dopamine release? I to be honest, I don't know. Is it joyous? Yeah, that feels pretty good when suddenly you find a connection like that. I think it makes me happy.
Maybe it's I don't know what the principle is, but I know at least it's true for me. I don't know if it's true for everybody. Most people, it seems to me it's true for, but again, I'm biased. So whenever I got a bias, I try to look some other direction. But one thing I do know is, someone's self-esteem is greatly enhanced or diminished by how much they feel they control events versus events control them. And you brought up one of the most important elements. It's one of the things that I respect about you personally. And it's one of the reasons I think you're so good at what you do is you're incredibly good at pattern recognition. I talk to people all the time, like, you've got young kids, I've got young kids, I've got a brand new young kid, and I got grandkids. And I look at 2040 and go, that sounds like a long time to some people, but I know a decade goes like this. In 2040, I read all these studies about, they're done at Oxford about like, we're going to see 1 billion jobs disappear. And everybody's like, well, we'll create all the new ones. I'm sure we will long term. But, Sanjay, that you look back in 150 years ago, we were like 90%, 85% farmers. And we went from that to 3% and we feed the world, but it went over a century and a half.
Right.
And now we've got changes that are happening like, self-driving cars. 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, but it's going to happen. Who's going to buy, pay for a truck driver to work 8 hours who wants health insurance and might go on strike when they can buy a vehicle that can work 24 hours a day and have lower insurance and they can write down the cost. So that, you take Uber drivers, truck drivers, you take taxi drivers, that's 5 million people in the US alone. That's the entire job loss that we saw in 2008. And so no one's preparing these people. So one of the things I'm passionate about, and that's one of the reasons I really want people to get your book as well, is pattern. I think there's 3 pieces that make somebody powerful at what they do. I don't care if it's a dancer, a singer, the best financial traders. You and I know some of the best people in the world in a variety of categories where they own a domain like you do. And what makes them great? Pattern recognition is number 1, but then it's pattern utilization, right? You can see a pattern, but if you can't figure out how to use it for a greater good, and then ultimately what makes them masterful is pattern creation. And I think those 3 patterns are what I'm trying to teach my grandkids and my children, because that's what's going to make them. It doesn't matter what job changes are, those skill sets are going to be there, but you can't have those skill sets if not all this is functioning at the highest level.
I totally agree with you. Obviously, Tony. I mean, I think that the one of the not ironies, but one of the things I think that was a real insight for me was basically what you're saying, but in the form of fundamentally, I do believe that people generally know the right thing to do.
I agree.
So in some ways it becomes a question of why did you do the wrong thing, right? Yeah. You knew the right thing to do, but you did the wrong thing. Again, I'm telling you, Tony, I mean, people come to you for this sort of knowledge.
You don't apologize. I'm learning from you, brother. Keep going.
But I think I think it's very interesting, like how how you perceive something. Is it that you didn't know the right thing or you chose to do the wrong thing? And if you use bad judgment, bad decisions, why is it? Like, what's the root cause of that problem? And I think this gets back to healthy brain. someone who's feeling better about themselves, someone who feels more empathetic, is wider
Yeah.
circle of view. Their aperture of life is wider. They're not looking so much in the reactionary moment. They're able to look further down the line and sort of imagine themselves further down the line and still having
Yeah.
a good life further down the line.
Yeah.
That is in part the healthy brain. But I didn't, I like when you bring up the example of these drivers, 5 million jobs lost.
Yeah.
Like probably like you, I imagine your mind immediately went to, so what are we going to do about that? Right.
Exactly.
What are we going to do about that? Person who's saying, what are we going to do about that? They're able to have a wider circle of them because you're wanting to solve that problem. We got to be thinking about, different levels of education. We're going to figure out what the next sector of society is. It's going to require these types of skills.
So you think that comes from a healthy brain as opposed to a value system, or do you think it's both?
Okay, that's a very fair question. I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily the same for everybody. A healthy brain doesn't immediately equate to this ability, I don't think.
But if you define a healthy brain as that larger circle that you care for and you're tied to, maybe it does.
Yeah, I guess if the core motivation is that I'm worried about these 5 million people. I mean, that's my core motivation. It's just, I'm not looking at this from a strict policy standpoint. I'm really feeling empathetic towards these people. Then I think the healthy brain part kicks in. I mean, it doesn't give you immediate talents to be able to recognize patterns. For some people, that's a real skill, but it's putting you in that direction of, I'm going to solve this problem. And there's different ways to solve the problem. I mean, an educator may look at this problem different than a tech person versus someone who's a policymaker, but they can all bring something to the table.
Very true. You've designed this as your book. I want to get back to your book, make sure we get people to pick up your book because it's fantastic. You've designed
it. Great for me talking to you, Tony.
Well, no, it's true, but I like it because you chunked it. Most people get overwhelmed when they read a book and then they don't do anything with it. And my whole thing, when I read a book, you can see I've got yours all marked up and consumed and tabulated and so forth. When I read a book, I'm consuming to figure out what am I going to do with it? Because I believe if you let your learning lead to knowledge, you become a fool. My original teacher said, let your learning lead to action. That's how you really make a difference for your life and for the people you care about. So what I loved was the 12-week chunking. So I know you can't get the whole book in here, but can you give us just a little bit of an idea of why the 12 weeks? What are some of the key steps, just so we can get people to have some information right now they can act on, and I'm sure they'll go pick up your book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started to try and translate this, one thing I did that I always do is I will try and bounce these things off my teenage daughters and see if they understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And they are, let me tell you, they're sharp critics, Tony. I'm not going to lie to you. Ooh, Dad, no. That is a common one I get. But I do want
your own land.
Right. I do want to, make sure I, can explain things in a way that's going to be accessible for people. But the second, and I think you'll appreciate this, I needed to be able to do it in my own life.
Yes.
I'm a busy guy. A lot of people are. And so, it's great to suggest things, but if it's totally impractical, it kind of misses the mark. To your point, I want action, not just the knowledge. It's got to be translatable. So, and what I try to figure out where people are already in their lives with regard to the big sort of basic things, in terms of movement, in terms of how they nourish, in terms of how they rest. And I use those words specifically: movement as opposed to exercise, nourishment instead of diet, rest instead of sleep, because I wanted to explain what the value of these things were.
I love the way you did that.
We know that it's good to move. We know that that's not a surprise. We know that it probably doesn't make sense to either sit or lie for 23 hours a day and then go to the gym for an hour. Yeah. We kind of know that. But what I thought was interesting was that the brain is different. And if you believe that everything begins in the brain, you want to make the brain as healthy as you can, so you make all the best decisions then for your body, your diet, your relationships, then the type of movement for the brain is really important. We want to do a type of movement that actually releases a lot of these neurotrophic factors that help grow new brain cells. And we don't want at the same time to do things that diminish those neurotrophic factors. So what does that translate to? And I'm not just making this up. Look at the data. Brisk walking is going to be far better than intense exercise when it comes to your brain.
Mhm.
If you want to intensely exercise, that's great. And, you want to win your triathlon time, fantastic. But if you're specifically thinking, I am right now engaged in a period of time when I'm going to optimize my brain, it is brisk walking. Why? Because the neurotrophic factors are released in abundance to brisk walking, but you don't get the corresponding stress hormones and cortisol that
Right.
dampen the effect.
Right.
It's as simple as that. I mean, sometimes these things were not that complicated. So that's an example of something that I introduce people to sort of in the first couple of weeks and really explain why.
Yeah.
And then I would layer something into that. We know connection is really important. Again, that's not new knowledge, but what we're learning more and more is that it's the profundity of the connection. And by the way, I can measure that. I can measure the depths of your connections in a way. One of the ways to develop a particularly profound connection with somebody quickly is to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
is to ask for help. And it's uncomfortable. But if you do that, you rapidly increase the profundity and power of that connection.
Mm.
And so, when I was thinking about the things that I would ask people to do, it would be to take a brisk walk with a close friend and talk about your problems.
Mhm.
Do you think of that as brain sort of movement, brain sort of nourishment? It is. Out of all the things I could tell you, read these great books, eat this certain meal, taking a brisk walk with a close friend and talking about your problems may be one of the most beneficial things you can do for your brain overall. It gets at some of the biggest things. And I use that as an example, Tony, of how I layer people through these 12 weeks, getting
Yeah.
them to that point and that vulnerability and how to get to that vulnerability, writing letters, how to ask for help, all that sort of stuff, which I never thought would be part of a brain book. But
Yes.
those are the steps you need to take to get the optimization that we're talking about.
And again, Sanjay, it sounds like I'm a fanboy for you. I guess I probably am. It's
Right
because
back at you.
I think I think one of your great skills on screen is that you are vulnerable. Like you share information, but it's not just intellectual. Like you can feel your concern. You can feel when you're not sure of the answer and you don't know the answer, and you'll say that, which I don't see many doctors say. I think it's one of the reasons people respect and love you so much. I think that's beautiful. Give us a one more piece. I love that because first of all, you hear it on the surface and you go, oh, come on, right? But the beautiful part about it is it's so actionable. And you and I both know about 48% roughly, depending on which research project you read, of what we do is habit. We have the same thoughts, the same feelings. And so your whole description about doing something different taps into that. But to take something that is so natural and so easy and so effortless and be able to develop brains that someone can do this at any age, right? That's what I love about this. And it doesn't matter if they're advanced in age or they're young. This is something that we all desperately need and want. It's what makes us feel more alive and makes us more human. Give us another tip, if you would, out of the 12 weeks.
Yeah, and by the way, just with the walking thing in the brisk walk, that is, I mean, that was the whole point that you, like, I think we're always making choices in our life, right? A lot of people who are thinking about their brains, people who may be listening right now, they're thinking, okay, I want to do the best thing for my brain, kind of like I would go for a run for my heart, whatever.
Yes.
Like, what is the best
Yes.
thing for my brain? I really, I know that people sort of fundamentally understand this, but there are best ways to live.
Yes.
This isn't just a random sort of way that we're navigating our way through life. There is a best way to live for your body, for your brain, for your mind, and all that.
Your
That
well-being.
knowledge exists. Yeah. So sometimes people feel like it's just preordained. What's going to happen is going to happen. What control do I have? It's this very sort of hapless sort of, way of looking at things. It doesn't have to be that way. That's not trying to make you do something. That's making you think differently about what is likely to happen or not. I think another big one, though, we talked about the idea of discovery in the form of new hobbies and preferably ones with your hands. I think when it comes to nourishment, it's a really interesting sort of paradigm because, again, I fully believe that once people get to the healthy brain, they're going to make good food choices. It's like evolutionarily speaking, I want to be here.
Yes.
I'm not doing not
Makes new momentum, doesn't it? Like a new identity for somebody.
I want to be here. When it comes to nourishment, in order to get to that healthy brain where you make those good decisions, I really do spend a lot of time getting very specific about sugar.
Yes.
And I'm not the first. I did a 60 Minutes piece on this years ago called The Toxic Truth, which, a lot of people took issue with. But the thing about it is that the brain is exquisitely sensitive to sugar. Let me
Yeah.
just put it like that. So at a time when you're taking in lots of calories in the form of glucose, what often happens is you get all these receptors in your body that are basically saying, come on in, tons of energy, we'll store it, and that's great. And that ends up, leading to overweight, obesity, putting you at risk of diabetes, all the things that we talk about. What is interesting about the brain is that as you saturate glucose into the bloodstream there, the brain, because it's so sensitive, can immediately turn off the receptors. So it just shuts the door on it, right?
Yeah.
So you run into a situation where you may be overly indulging your body and starving your brain at the same time.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. Tell
So
people what the long-term impact of that is.
well,
The
so
short-term impact, obviously, tell them the short-term, but also the long-term so they understand.
the short-term impact is that's the wall. That's the
Yeah.
wall that people talk about.
Yeah.
You were the most creative guy in the world 10 minutes ago, and now you can't even think straight.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't memory loss. This isn't the beginnings of dementia. This is an acute phenomenon, as you're describing. But the problem, Tony, to your point, is that when you start to starve the brain that way, you set off these metabolic processes that are probably, though we're still learning about this, a breeding ground for plaques and tangles and inflammation and things like that become a forest fire of changes in your brain that could potentially, be a setup for dementia. I don't want to overstate it. I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting everyone who eats too much sugar is going to get dementia, but once you start to understand the process of what's happening here, it'll change the way you eat right away. You just won't do it. I'm going to eat this sugar and I'm going to starve my brain, and I know I'm going to not be able to think straight. I'm not going to enjoy myself. I'm not going to have as quality time with the kids. Why would I do that? That's another big one.
Wow. As an aside, I know on COVID, I just read the other day that 77% of the people that die of COVID, not get COVID, are obese.
Yes.
It seems to be, other than age, the highest other criteria that could influence you. And I got them, and you talk about people also talking about post-COVID brain fog and so forth, and the majority of them are obese. I was reading yesterday that in Thailand, they have 66 million people. And there's 128 COVID deaths, 128.
Right.
It's like trying to figure that out. Well, part of it is they don't have a test that goes 40 times, so they don't classify people. But the bigger part is they're not obese there. It's pretty wild. Where's the link between, do you see any link between what's happening with people as some of the side effects of COVID afterwards that are also related to obesity in your mind or not? And obesity obviously being the sugar uptake in the brain or lack thereof.
Totally. Well, I got to tell you, first of all, it is an interesting when you draw those comparisons between countries, for sure. Taiwan. Yeah. I mean, we're going to have 600,000 people who have died of COVID in this country, and there's other countries that count their deaths in the hundreds, maybe even lower than that. Yeah. And some of that is certainly the matrix, the substrate of the country, the health of the country. Yeah. Some of it was, I'll be honest with you, this may not have even been the black swan event that people necessarily talk about. The black swan event where you got this highly contagious virus that is also very lethal. This was highly contagious and it was very lethal, but you start talking about 10% mortality rates versus 1%. That's obviously, that'd be a disaster.
And we've already got that with heart disease and cancer, and that no one that talks about it anymore because they're so used to it, right? What is it, 3,000 or 4,000 people die a day of cancer and heart disease? It was like, that's like, a 9/11 happening every day, but they're moms and dads, but we don't see it. And so we've gotten used to it somehow.
Well, heart disease is still the biggest killer in the country. 600,000 people die of heart disease every year. Yeah. Although COVID, a disease that didn't even exist a year ago, will probably surpass that. So I think it is dramatic when something that didn't even exist ago suddenly becomes the biggest killer of citizens in a country. But nevertheless, I think that the idea, especially now, as we sort of think that we are starting to come out the other side of this, I feel a light on my face for the first time in a while. You're looking at me in my basement, by the way. This is the basement closet where I'm talking to you from. I mean, this is my life. I've been in this sensory deprived closet I wouldn't do this to my good friends or my worst enemies, So, but anyways, the idea that it's going to get better, I think is definitely true, but it has sort of revealed or reminded of this problem. We got 30% obesity rates in this country, and that was one of the biggest risk factors for getting really sick and even dying of COVID.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about that? I mean, we're going to do lots of things different. We're going to be more pandemic proof. We're going to search for viruses so that they don't turn into as big a problem. We'll create antivirals. We'll have better public health. But we got to, it starts with us. It really does. We see that how big a risk factor that was. So what does recovery look like for, that's a big objective of mine going forward, to really take whatever good we can, whatever inspiration we can out of this and use it for good, which is to get America healthier.
Yeah, because we have an impact. We can have an impact on our immune system, as we can have an impact on our brain, but we seem to be, outsourcing that to the pharmaceutical industry, and they can do a great job for us, but they only do so much if you aren't doing your part. True?
Absolutely. I mean, it is amazing how much we outsource of that stuff. That's a really good way of putting it. I mean, people spend more time figuring out their grocery store in their local community than they do like their own medical care. I mean, we outsource it. And you know what? Going back to being a little humble about this and acknowledging, blame, part of that's probably just the medical establishment overall. It's been too didactic. It's too top down. People are, told what to do, not always why they're doing it or, how to feel empowered around that. That's too bad. There are countries around the world that spend 100,000th of what we spend on healthcare every year and have much better healthcare systems because they don't outsource. Yeah. We're brilliant in terms of taking care of end stage cancer, all these different problems, but just the basic care gets lost. Maybe that's the hubris of a wealthy country, Tony. Maybe we always want to wait for the home run and the touchdown and the knockout punch. We don't want to just lean into the basics. Yeah. Why would I eat right? I could take the purple pill. That's it. Yeah. That's the metaphor.
I feel for doctors though, too, because, you see, the metaphor I try to give people is, doctors out there, I know you're an example of it. Like, here you're doing all this and you're a neurosurgeon. I mean, I can only imagine how you try to manage all this and be a father and be a husband and be, I got my own versions of that, but I know what that must be, get a sense like for you. And then, here you are trying to help somebody and you're seeing all these people like they're drowning in water, and you jump in, you swim, save one, and then there's two, and you save two, then there's four. There's no time to go upstream, see who's throwing them in, and it's like, and I look at that today, it's really fascinating. And there's so much new data coming out. I was looking at this group called New Amsterdam Genomics. I don't know, are you familiar with that company? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I love what they do because every 2 weeks, they don't just give you a genome breakdown because your genome is, as you know, is the light bulb. The light switch is epigenomics. Right? That's what's going to trigger it. Two people with the same genes have a different life. But what I love is like, how do you keep up with this? And they literally have an AI, for those of you not familiar with the company, and every 2 weeks it reads all the new journals. And it's an average of 3 million pieces of literature every 2 weeks. How would a doctor ever keep up with that? I mean, there's, the half-life of medical education, I don't know what it is now, 4 or 5 years. I haven't read the most recent study, but holy cow, it's a tough job. And that's why I think we got to be the CEO of our own health. That's why I'm having you on. I want people to take charge because there's little things that we can do that can prevent you ever being in that place. So let's talk about those 2 words nobody wants to think about within themselves, with their family, and that's obviously dementia and Alzheimer's. What, the second part of your book there, you focus on not losing your mind a little bit, I think is the language you used, if I remember right. And tell me, what do you know about science now that can help us not have to deal with this? Or if we are dealing with it, what are some of the things that we can do to help someone or ourselves start to turn things around? What's the latest science showing us?
The latest science is revealing that we probably will have something that comes in the form of a pharmaceutical sometime. I'm only stating that at the beginning to just give you a sense of, we've gone 20 years, basically 15 to 20 years now without any new therapeutics with regard to Alzheimer's. I mean, possibly going to be one of the biggest neurodegenerative diseases of our lifetime. We don't have anything really. Yeah. I mean, and I'm not trying to sound dramatic, but you just think about that at a macro level. Think about any other disease that's going to be that prevalent where we basically say, well, I don't know what to do, so that's an issue. What I think from a scientific perspective, though, is most exciting. There will be something exciting in that arena, but what I think is most exciting is that we can now visualize the brain in a way that we couldn't before. And this is really relevant. The brain was like a black box. A black box is something that you measure by its inputs and its outputs. You never really get an idea of the internal machinations of the brain. Now we can, because we can image it and measure it and measure its function in different ways. So that's really, I think, very important in terms of determining what's going to work best to basically handle, a burgeoning sort of crisis of Alzheimer's and dementia, because the numbers are increasing. One thing I found extraordinarily inspiring in my case, although it was presented, I think, as a piece of bad news, was that if you look at people with dementia, what you now know is that the process began in their brains decades earlier.
Yes.
Okay? So they're in their 70s, whatever, 80s, and they have now diagnosed Alzheimer's. But we know from lots of data that people who've had their brain imaged decades earlier actually have the signs of plaque and tangle, things that would be associated with what they call preclinical disease. You have the disease, you just don't have any symptoms yet. Now, people were horrified. 45 million people, they think, in the country are in this position right now. To me, that meant one thing, which is you can have a brain that has plaques and tangles in it and still be functioning normally. That's what I want you to focus on.
Yeah.
Don't focus so much on getting rid of the plaques and the tangles, because we know that you can still function normally if you have those in your brain. So who are the people who continue to have these plaques and tangles and never develop symptoms? Who are they? Why does that happen for them? And how can I get myself into that position? That's really, in so many ways, I'm simplifying, but that's where the science is sort of headed. We know who these people are. And that gets back to a lot of what we were talking about in terms of cognitive reserve, cognitive resilience, building those extra roads. It's not that I don't have plaque in my brain. It's just that plaque that blocked the road I drive, that's not a problem for me. I got 50 other roads I can drive.
Around it, right.
Around it. So do I have Alzheimer's? If you were to objectively measure plaque in my brain, you could say that that's someone who has evidence of Alzheimer's disease. Is it consequential for me? No. I'm living not only am I living a cognitively normal life, I'm continuing to grow new brain cells. So I think that's one of the exciting areas just overall about where the science is headed. There's going to be all these other interesting things in terms of injecting AI platforms into our behavior.
Yes.
What is the best way? By the way, it's not 10,000 steps for you. You're actually much better with 9,000 steps. And by the way, don't ever call your mom on Tuesdays, because you always have a busy meeting on Tuesday afternoons. And running in the morning is definitely better for you than running in the afternoon. Yes. There's going to be AI that's going to really inject and infuse how we live. But ultimately, what I'm describing, I think this idea that there is a best way to continue to rewire the brain exists. Yes. And now we'll just figure out the best ways to get there.
There's so many companies right now too that are there's so much money going at just dealing with aging. The benefit, I think, of having a Silicon Valley and the kind of innovation that's gone there is also there's been wealth there that's ridiculous, wealth that can never be spent. And these individuals are now funding, like the guys from Google, types of research that has never existed before, just traditionally through medicine. The funds are flowing. And we're also starting to digitize health, right? It's like we know CRISPR is an example of it, obviously, or the new version of Prime, that we're starting to know that the whole human mechanism is code. So every technology that we've seen grow that we now take for granted, that, on our hand, we got a phone that's 1,000 times more powerful and 1/millionth the price of what took us to the moon, right? But it now grows, as we all know, it doubles in its power, it halves in its cost. But now we're digitizing health. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about the time you and I are alive, and our kids and our grandkids. I mean, that we're literally on the verge of breakthroughs, and that's what people need to understand. But they got to do the things you're talking about so they can hang around long enough for the 5, 10, 15 years for some of this stuff to kick in. Do you agree, or how do you feel about that?
Look, I totally agree with you, Tony. Here's the thing, I think, and this may be more of a philosophical discussion, which I'm love to have with you, and that is that, yes, we will figure out through genomics, through proteomics, through a lot of the research that's happening and aggregating large data like that, so we can find these patterns and all the things that you're talking about, and we can gene edit, in the form of CRISPR and all these types of things, in order to what? In order to live a long, happy life, right?
Right.
And I think it's wonderful, and I think it's great because it's an intellectual sort of pursuit that entire industries and smart people get around. The only thing I'm saying, and this is the irony, is that we don't actually need all that stuff to get there.
No, I agree with you, brother. I agree with you 100%.
We're creating technologies to solve a problem
that we can solve ourselves
another way. Right. Yeah. And that's okay. I mean, it really is okay because, it's kind of like we sent a man to the moon. Why?
Yes.
What did that do for us? Well, we got GPS out of it. We got better flying golf balls, autonomous vehicles, all these things in some ways derive from that. So there's all these halo benefits of saying, I want to promote, these longevity therapeutics and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Part of me does think, Tony, that we'd be better spent just doing the basics that get us there, easy, cheap, and focusing all that intellectual capital on bigger problems. Not that this isn't a big problem, but like important, life sustaining. We got like these huge things. Everyone's planning for the future. Like, what does that mean right now? I mean, I want people thinking about that. So
I agree with you. And when we're healthy brains, right, which by your definition means like we have these larger connections and larger levels of caring, you tend to do that because when you care about somebody, you think about consequences in their life. That's part of it, right? That's what compassion is. You step in their shoes.
Yes.
You and I were 3 years ago yesterday, we were in a place that really shifted my life. You and I were together, we're at the Vatican, and there's a conference the Pope does every 2 years. It's a regenerative medicine conference. Stem cells a big part of that, believe it or not, but it's not fetal stem cells. So the Pope sees this as a gift from God. It's a way to transform life. You and I met people with stage 3 cancer turned around, all these different rare diseases turned around. I was blown away. I got the privilege of being the cleanup speaker at the end, but I said, I'm not coming for the end. I'm coming for the whole thing. I'm going to learn. And I'd had this experience of stem cells where I torn my rotator cuffs so severely in a silly snowboarding accident, chasing a 25-year-old who snowboards all the time. And I tore them so bad that the pain was 9-9. And 3 different surgeons said that's the only way. You got to have surgery. This is torn. There's no way. And then the process can, as you know, sometimes your shoulder can get frozen. It takes 3-6 months for rehab. And I was like, I met Dr. Bob Harari, who became my friend, who spoke at that conference. And now my partner, he's kind of one of the founders of stem cells. And he said, don't get the stem cells here. Here's where to go. Here's what to do. I had those stem cells. Not only did my spinal stenosis disappear, I stood up for the first time without pain in 14 years, but nothing in my shoulder. So I thought that was the breakthroughs. And then I went there and discovered things like the Wnt pathway. And it was amazing to be there. And so there are these tools that are coming. And I'm interested in those. I still think, I want people to do what they can do. That's why I'm having you on. But I think it's good for people to know, like, for example, if they have Alzheimer's, I know at UCSF, there's a new video game they've created, and it's not complex. It's driving a car, but with all these distractions. And it allows people who are in their 70s and 80s, within 4 to 6 weeks, according to UCSF, to have the same cognitive capacity as somebody in their 20s again. Like, because it interrupts you and you have to recover. And that's, I guess, part of what happens sometimes in Alzheimer's. You lose your point of view and you can't get back to it. So there's some tools out there that are amazing, and I want people to know about them. But I'm curious, what are you most excited about that's coming besides what we can do now? I'm not negating everything you said because I'm in your corner. CEO of your own health is who you need to be. But what are some of the things coming so if somebody is already in a bad position that they could say, oh, these are some of the things that could make a difference in any of these areas around brain health or just anything around vitality as a whole that you're excited about?
Well, yes.
And what did you pull from that conference? I'm curious because that was 3 years ago. What did it stick with you?
Well, okay. So the conference, the cell-based therapy conference was I think a pretty indelible experience for me, as it sounds like it was for you as well.
Yes.
I found it very interesting because there hasn't really been there hasn't been a good regulatory pathway in the United States for stem cells. So I think a lot of times it gets ignored. to be honest,
Yeah.
and even
Yeah.
sort of stigmatized a bit, because so many of the initial sort of forays into stem cell therapies were done in an unregulated way. So I think it sort
Yeah.
of blackened the eyes of stem cell. And what you and I saw when we went to the Vatican, which I also found quite interesting, that a cell-based therapy conference happening at the Vatican with the
Yeah.
Pope in attendance, it was very interesting. But what we saw was data from people who have more lax regulatory pathways in their countries, like Germany, like Israel,
Yes.
doing studies on everything from injured knees and painful joints to children with autism.
Yes.
I mean, I'm fascinated by it. I think that the knock was, well, you don't have any data, and maybe this is going to be dangerous. There is data that exists. This kind of reminds me in some ways of the marijuana story. I had to
Yeah.
start looking overseas to find the real data, because it's just those studies weren't getting funded in the States. And that happened a lot in the United States as well. And some of that was the collision of science and theology dating back to, 2000, 2001 timeframe. It
Yes.
put us behind. Other countries really took the lead on stem cells. So I found it really interesting, Tony. And like you, I spent a lot of time talking to patients. Like, just tell me about your experience. You and I connected over that, and I heard about your experience. One thing I'll never do as a doctor is tell a patient, you didn't have that happen to you. You didn't benefit from that. Who am I to tell somebody they didn't benefit from something?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a truism that I'll always keep. It doesn't. It is my job to make sure you're safe. I would not want you to do anything that harm you. But if you take something and you say you benefit from it, I'm not going to say no, you did not. And that's a little bit of where we are with stem cells right now.
Yeah.
I think it's just a fascinating idea that you could take cells from your own body, minimally manipulate them, and then inject them back into your own body. What is that? Is that a drug? Is that a device? No, it's something totally different. It's your own body, So I really took a lot out of that for sure. And I'm excited about that area. To answer your second question, I think that the idea of, to me, in some ways, it's an extension of the same thing. We all contain the capacity to heal ourselves.
Yes.
I want to be careful when I say that, because there are people who truly have problems. that require extraneous treatment. So I don't want to overstate that, but I think largely within us, we have the capacity to heal ourselves, of body and of mind. And I think the cell-based therapies is a good example of that. Sometimes it's through this, we're going to take cells from one part of your body that are highly regenerative cells, inject them into another part and get these benefits. I think is just really fascinating. I'm really fascinated, Tony, by the artificial intelligence and machine learning platform.
Me too. Yeah, me too.
You're seeing this stuff. I'm seeing this stuff. This to me gets back to this idea that there is a best way to live. I envision a world where I live my happiest and healthiest life, but I also, because of the wonderful technology and innovation around me, that the perfect meal for me shows up wherever I am at the right time that I need it. Mm. The right food, right person, right place, right time. That technology exists right now. Yeah. We spend I read a study, 30 to 40% of our time we spend thinking about food. Like, what are we going to eat? How am I going to cook it? And almost 100% of the time we get it wrong. So we spend all this time thinking about food and we almost always get it wrong. there is a right answer out there. I know that Tony woke up early this morning. Tony had a late night last night. He's going to need more protein before 9 o'clock. That juice that he normally drinks, that'll upset his stomach. That comes at 11 o'clock. You don't know that stuff. You can't process all that. That's like the 3 million journals that, the AI platform is reading, but that knowledge exists. So optimizing our lives through technology in a way that is frictionless, just part of our life. I expect the food to be there when I need it. Right as I'm getting hungry, the food shows up and it is the perfect meal for me.
Yes.
I know the perfect time to move. I know how to check in on my kids in a way to have those profound connections that I was talking about. I don't know what it was like when your kids were teenagers, but right now, like I'm struggling. I have 3 teenage girls in the house.
All at the same time. You got a lot of hormones going on in there too.
Hormones. I write books about the brain and I do all this stuff. I cannot figure out these 3 teenage girls. I'm thinking I'm a good dad, right? This is a conversation often as my head's hitting I'm a good dad, right, Rebecca? Yes, you're a good dad. Why do they talk to me?
Funny. Oh my gosh. Well, listen, you wrote in your book about the Synapse Project about these super agers, I think you called their super brain people in their 80s and 90s, and they have cognitive abilities that are the same as people in their 30s. What did you learn from them?
That was more in some ways, what ended up being a confirmation of what we thought was already possible.
Okay.
We originally approached it as exactly as you described, and we call them super brainers because in the context of things, they still are. But there was really, there was a few specific mutations that we find that may be beneficial. But the thing that really jumped out at us, and we spend a lot of time talking to longevity researchers about people who are super agers, super brainers, and all that, and they haven't really basically said, okay, well, this is the super brain gene. If you have this, you will have a super brain. It's the collection of things. It's almost always influenced, as you talked earlier, about more about the environment and the epigenetics even more than the genetics.
Yeah.
So it was more a confirmation that the brain can, even as you age, continue to get sharper. That was basically it. We met 90-year-old stockbrokers who are still doing 5-digit math in their head, just like that.
Yes.
I mean, I can't do 5-digit math. I probably never could because that wasn't a thing that I did.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't think that you would still be able to do those things. And we think of memory as I remember what to buy at the grocery store when Sage sends you over to the grocery store, whatever it might be. It's not that. It's really that ability to assimilate all this different knowledge and make it meaningful.
I think you just said the key word there is meaningful, it seems like to me. And in my own experience, and I don't have your scientific background, it's the more meaningful it is, the more connections you make in the brain, right? The more you remember it, the more it's there. And so the things that are meaningful and the people associate to meaningful are the things they remember. That and emotion, because if you ask anybody, where were you in 9/11? Do you remember the moment you heard about it? Anybody, even in other countries, will tell you. But you ask them, where were you on 8/11 of the same year? They don't have a clue, because information without emotion is barely retained. But when it's meaningful, when there's an emotion connected to it, I think my guess is, I'm not a neuroscientist, you've got to be making more connections in the brain, and therefore, you have more roadways to be able to hang on or pull back that information. How true or inaccurate is that?
So it's very true, and it actually has led to a whole new way of thinking about things. When we have strong emotion associated with an event, you tend to release, again, a lot of the same adrenocortical stress hormones that we talk about. That's a fight or flight. You get a little stomach, feels a little queasy, whatever it might be. That's all that. That's the physiological response. What we also know is your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, and those stress hormones actually, in a way, sear the memories into your hippocampus even stronger.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's absolutely true. What is fascinating, Tony, and again, you read so much, you may know this already, but it can be too much, right? You can get to the point of post-traumatic stress.
Exactly.
You're incurring the memory over and over again, and it's repetitive and it's destructive. And what people have started doing, based on the knowledge that you just described, is actually giving anti-hypertensive medications in the emergency room. Someone has had a traumatic experience. I'm going to lower their blood pressure, because when I lower their blood pressure, fewer stress hormones, less likely to become an impenetrable, repetitive, destructive memory. Fascinating, right? So fascinating.
They're doing that now, Sanjay?
They're doing that now. People who've had traumatic, like got hit by a car on their bicycle, women who have been raped, antihypertensives, beta blockers are
Yes.
used to, people take, I don't know if you've ever done it, probably not because it would take away your energy, but sometimes people who have terrible stage fright will take a little beta blocker before they go out on stage. It's that
Wow.
same type of medication to basically just bring down your stress hormone levels and make it less likely to be a destructive memory.
Wow. Tell me, you wrote about something in the book, this dementia village. I think it was in Amsterdam, if I remember correctly. And tell us a little bit about that and what you learned from it. And are you familiar with Dr. Langer's work? Where back, I think it was in the 1980s. She's a friend. I met her. She's, for those not familiar with her work, she did a lot of work with people in their 70s and late mid 70s, if I'm describing this properly. I remember she put them in a monastery, and she's telling me the story in depth, and I read about it later. But what she basically did is have them go back in time. She made the monastery where all the pictures were of them when they were young in their 20s, was the equivalent of their 20s on the radio and the music, and asked them to act like it. And then she took a group where she put in the same monastery, but they didn't act like it. They didn't change the visuals. And not only did they change like a variety of things, like they sat up straighter, their posture was better. Those are things you could guess on. But their hearing increased and their sight increased. And not only that, but the quality of their life increased. Are you familiar with that study? And can you give us any feedback about Dementia Village and how do we deal with people as they age so that, besides all things you talked about, so perhaps the environment, because the biggest thing I got from her was that the expectations of the people around you radically affect the unconscious thinking. I mean, I know this obviously, of how people respond. And so in our culture, as people get older, very often it's different than, let's say, an Asian culture, where sometimes elderly is wisdom. Our culture used to have that, but we're so youth obsessed. It's a little different. So I guess I have two questions out of this. Are you familiar with this study, and how much does the expectations of the people around us and our expectations of ourselves affect how we age or how our minds or brains work? And anything you want to share about Dementia Village, because I found it interesting.
You've got me thinking, Tony, right now, because I read some of Langer's work, and this is from 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
I did not even know some of those findings about improved senses and things like that. It's really interesting sight and hearing. So I want to answer the question. Let me tell you about Dementia Village, which I just thought was really interesting. It was basically these two hospice nurses who were friends, and they were sitting around talking and about some of their worst fears for their own parents. And, given that they take care of people in these settings, they sort of both came to this conclusion that one of the worst things was if one of their parents developed Alzheimer's and needed to be in a inpatient medical facility of some sort. They found that all those types of setups that they had seen were very dehumanizing. They didn't actually change the outcome at all or improve the outcome or lengthen the duration of life. It was basically just a really, really sterile, unfamiliar, non-empathetic holding ground for people who were slowly losing their memory. So they wanted to create something different. Probably some of it was based on Langer's work, because there was this belief initially with music that the more that you can actually immerse someone in things that are familiar, the better it is overall for them in terms of their thinking. Yes. And not necessarily bring back all these memories, but their thinking and their judgment and their ability to interact would improve. So what they did was, and this is in Amsterdam, they basically just bought a little village and turned the entire village. I'm talking movie theaters and hair salons and restaurants and piano bar and all these things and living accommodations into a village. Every single resident there has dementia. Every single person who works there is a caretaker. They live in these settings. Like if you came from a engineering background, you would be in a housing that would be with people who are familiar to you. Artists would live in another area. People who are business people would live in another area, so they could immerse them in that sort of comfortable, familiar setting. Yes. And there was two things that jumped out at me. I love doing the story because I just thought it was a really humane way to take care of people. Yeah, I just felt like they were happier and they're not being medicalized. It's more just we recognize here's what is happening with your mind and your brain. Here's the best way to live in that situation. Yes. I thought that was beautiful. They also found that, like you found with some of Langer's studies, people lived longer. They took fewer medications. They ate better. They reported better happiness scores. Their families reported better happiness scores. All this sort of stuff. It was really remarkable. And when we did the cost analysis on this, because people immediately said, well, why don't we do that in the United States? Why isn't there something in Florida and California, and Texas, and places where people retire that are these villages? Well, anyone can do the cost analysis on it. I did. It's cheaper. So you could create these villages now, and recognizing that there's going to be a large number of people who develop dementia over the next, few decades, and really understand that this is a really cost-effective, but also humane way to take care of elderly people who develop these problems. I worry about this myself. My grandfather had dementia. I thought my mom, maybe she'll still develop dementia. I'm a doctor. I live in this world, and I still don't know exactly what the right thing to do in terms of facility and the type of care and all of that. How does the average person figure that out? Think about a village. Searching for the solution ahead of time, like you do, seeing the pattern, which is very evident, and doing something about it. So that's what Dementia Village was really all about.
Well, let's hit another subject that sounds overly simple and boring, but you talked about that. You didn't call it sleep, you called it rest. I've had this attitude, I got to be honest, up until only a few years ago, and probably since I started studying it in depth. I'll sleep when I die. I'm a 4.5 hour sleeper. I can only do that so long, but 5 pretty consistently. I get 6, maybe once or twice in a month, and maybe 7 every 2 or 3 months. Now, recently, I've tried to work really hard to change that, because I read some studies, and the one that blew me away was the 1.65 billion person experiment, which is we see every single year. I see you nodding your head, so maybe I'll pass the ball to you on this one. Tell them about the experiment that we do, and tell me a little bit about rest and sleep. The experiment being daylight savings time, and what we've learned about it statistically around heart disease, for example.
So this has been a big topic of discussion for some time, probably going back to our early agricultural days where daylight savings came from in the first place, but really trying to understand the impact overall on our, I think there was a productivity study that was part of it, looking at our overall life expectancy and all that, and how that was impacted by daylight saving. I think that's the study you're talking about, right? Yeah, well,
but I want to relate to that to brain health, but the idea that I think it's 24% more heart attacks right after within a week. But when we go back, it drops almost proportionally, 23% less heart attacks. That's the thing that grabbed my brain, right? For just that 1 hour change for a society.
The 1 hour change that gave us that much more rest, which was, so I think that there's lots of good data about the health benefits of sleep. I mean, there's been literally encyclopedias written about this, and I'm like you, in that I know those things, but I still will try and hit the corners in terms of how much sleep I need. Right? What I think will resonate with you, Tony, because this resonated with me, is that most of our memory, most of our ability to actually recall things, that process by which those memories are stored happens during sleep.
Yeah, and REM sleep, right? Not just sleep.
A lot of it during REM sleep. And when you're getting that good quality sleep and you're storing those memories, that is the movie track of your life. Those are your memories. That's your narrative. If you aren't getting good sleep, you have all these amazing experiences, you aren't getting good sleep, you will not recall those experiences as well, if at all, later on in life. And I just say that as almost, again, a little bit of a broader look at, talk about the health impacts of lack of sleep. But if your goal is to have a life that you can continue to replay the wonderful movie track narrative in your life, you can share those experiences with others, all that you want to remember these things, you need to get good sleep. It's just that simple. You need to actually sleep at the time you're having these experiences so that you can really impregnate these memories into your hippocampus. I tell my kids this all the time, by the way, when they're trying to decide, do I stay up all night cramming or do I get some sleep? It's a pretty, when you understand the brain, it's a pretty easy answer. There is another rinse cycle that happens in the brain as well when you sleep. You're rinsing away these metabolic byproducts that we talked about earlier. And if they don't get, efficiently cleared, they can be a breeding ground for inflammation, dementia, all the things that we talk about. So there's all kinds of good reasons to get sleep. I would say for you, just as your friend,
please,
you should get more sleep. and you know, I right.
Do I need a, am I are you the kettle calling the pot black there, or?
I'm telling you, I'm your friend, right? We don't always practice what we preach. I'm your friend, but here,
I wear this freaking whoop because one thing I know is what gets measured gets, you know, you start to make improvements on. And I started wearing this whoop, and I have been now conscious about getting enough sleep, and specifically REM, because I know that's where the hippocampus stores your memories. And if you do that, you know, that's going to affect, if you don't get that REM sleep, it's going to affect your capacity.
yeah.
So I hear you.
Notice it in the short term, but like if I start to ask you about a year ago or periods in your life where you're really getting poor sleep, they are going to get blurry on you.
Yeah.
And maybe there were some wonderful experiences that happened there.
Yeah.
But you know, it is really interesting, Tony. I think you are really one of the most relentlessly positive people I know. So I wouldn't say that, you know, getting more sleep will make you happier, because I really feel like you are the guy I envision. I mean, I've told you this before, I'll say it again. Sometimes I need to imagine someone when I'm writing, what is the embodiment of the good that I'm trying to elicit, you know, in the reader's mind. And you are often the person that comes to mind. You really are. No, it's the energy. It's the relentless positivity. I feel like you are always so kind to me, but I think you are just that kind of person. Kindness to me, what I really think I've learned is that kindness to me is the ability to be kind. But I think almost more importantly, it's the act and the ability to interpret other things as kindness. You look at how people behave and you see the good in them. That's a profound kind of kindness. And so you really, but imagine you on sleep. All that you already have would be like turbocharged. So I think you should definitely, Tony on sleep.
I hope out of this podcast, one of the things that people will do is when I listen to something, you hear so many beautiful things. What I always try to do at the end is go, okay, out of this, what am I going to act on? And you're not going to do everything, but you know, are you going to say, okay, I'm going to create a brand new habit. Before I eat for 20 minutes, we're going to go walk with my wife or my friend or whoever it is. I'm going to do this piece. I'm going to make sure I sleep 1 more hour, 30 more minutes, or whatever the pieces are that you get here, or from Dr. Gupta's book here, that you just make them a habit. Because, you know, one of the things is people don't realize how easy it is to establish a habit. Habit stacking is one of the easiest ways. Like you're brushing your teeth and you do your vitamins at the same point, and after a while, you don't have to think about it. It just happens. Or just starting small. I think that's one of the great things that you do, Sanjay, is you make things easy. So you start with 3 push-ups, you know, and you might feel like an idiot, and then all you do is next step, you increase 1%, 2% a day. And before you knew it, you're doing 50 or 100 push-ups, you know, or just eliminating the decision. You know, all the research shows doing something every day is easier than 3 times a week. That's why certain things, like I get up in the morning, I do my cold plunge every morning. There's never a morning I look forward to it, but I do it every morning. And there's not a question. I don't negotiate with myself. It just happens. So a lot of what you want in your life, you can turn into positive habits. But if you learn something and it just becomes cognitive, that's useful. It means it's useful information, but will you retrace it? And the other thing I just want to put is you brought up something really important, which is those memories. You know, I don't think we're going to remember everything no matter what we do, but we're going to remember certain moments in our lives. Magic moments, I call them. And it's like, I remember one time, the one thing I felt like I could help people with anything, but the one thing I didn't feel effective at was when someone was dying, especially when someone was dying of, of a disease that's incurable. And it's like, what do I do? And I think part of that is I handled that within myself. And one day I was with this man, and I just like, what can I do to help him? And it's like, and I thought, I can help him polish up his memories. And so I spent 2 hours just asking him questions, which I naturally do anyway. I love people, about his life and what he'd been through and the loves of his life and the biggest challenges and things he was most proud of and what he was most grateful for. And I watched this man come to life with a level that was just so beautiful. But the secret, Sanjay, was stacking it. Not one question or two, but one after another after another. And and I know that you can have 10 minutes of anger and it's going to suppress your immune system for about 45 minutes to 2 hours, depending which research study you read, right? But I found that you can stack positive emotion and it'll flow for hours after that. And it starts to create a different pattern in the brain. And so that brings up one more question, and then I want a final question for you. And that is, there's a 4-letter word that has become an obsession in the last 12 months. And it is not necessarily the overuse of this thought is antithetical to almost all progress. And that word, right, that little 4-letter word really is relating to how we take risks today in society. It's like you look at people today, and now everybody, COVID being the driving force of it, is like no risk. Like, we've known, since the Lancet last June that our kids could be in school, right? They did 3 feet studies versus 6 feet studies, But today, regardless of the individual issue, it's like these same kids staying home. It's like, I'm going to stay home. I'm going to stay away from everything. Where is the asymmetrical risk reward? It's like, 1.2 million people die every year of car accidents, right? And you and I both know if I'm driving down the street, there's a lot of risk. There's somebody on their side of the street and there's nothing dividing this crazy, or this person who's drunk, or this person reading their texts, or this person who's fallen asleep from crossing the line and kill me, because it happens every day, but we still drive our cars. Why? Because otherwise you're gonna stay home and do nothing. How do we find that balance in our culture that is now being pushed to no risk so that we still have freedom and lives? What's your view of that? I'm curious.
Well, I think it's a really good point. I think there's a couple things. I think when we talk about risk, to some extent, it does, I think, matter when we evaluate something, what our level of control is with regard to the outcome.
Yes.
There are some things that are sort of, we feel like we have a greater sense of control over, which is why people will tend to drive instead of fly, even thinking flying is a lot safer.
It is safer.
You relinquish control, So if there is a human instinct to feel like you're in control. With COVID versus car accident, sort of the same thing. Like, I'm with the car, I feel like I can absolutely get into a car accident. There's no question, but I feel like I have greater control. With COVID, it's this thing that's floating out there in the air. I could become infected, all of that. And then there was also the notion that I don't even know what this does to me longer term, like you said, the brain fog and the long hauling symptoms.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, Tony, I think this has been one of the great learnings for me during this whole thing, is that if I come to you and I say something has a 0.5% mortality, okay, let's just say, and that's not even the right number, but let's just say that's the number for this discussion. There's a group of people who will say 0.5% mortality. So you're telling me 1 in 200 people will die. And oh my goodness, we better be careful. We got to, really protect ourselves. 1 in 200. Another population of people hearing the same objective data will say, so you're telling me I'm 99.5% good. What's the big fuss, right? Same data.
Yeah, exactly.
But the issue so that's just the truth, right? And that's how people's minds will work. But I think what I've learned, and the insight beyond the fact that the subjective interpretation of objective data is so different, is that if you are living a life where you don't have to really take risks, 0.5% could be a lot. Would you put your kid at a 0.5% risk of mortality? Let's just say if that was the issue, right? If this was something that predominantly affected kids, would you put your kid at that risk? Probably not. You could take spring break, but it's 0.5% mortality. I don't know if I want to do spring break anymore, right? So it's that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you are a frontline worker, an essential worker, somebody who has to be out there and you're taking risks all the time anyways, you may err on the 99.5% good. Yeah. And this breaks down across socioeconomic lines. It breaks down across racial lines. There's huge health inequities. So you're absolutely right. I mean, how do you evaluate risk? I mean, I'm surprised sometimes. I've had friends of mine who say, well, they told me that it would be a 0.1% chance of this happening. So of course I didn't do it. And I was saying, they are telling you a 0.1% chance because they're trying to tell you the preponderance, the likelihood is that it's not going to happen.
Exactly.
They're not willing to take the risk. It's I think in part based on where you're coming from, but it's fascinating to analyze the human behavior.
It's also, though, a part of it is the narrative that we give both in our education system and our media systems and all the systems that people start to do about how they look at things. Because this country certainly was developed by people that took gigantic risks, not 0.1, not 0.5. And, for my own child, I would look at it differently. I'd say, okay, what is the cost of avoiding that risk? That's the piece that's missing in these discussions so often. And our society has really shifted there. Let me ask you one final question, and I could go on with you forever, but you've been so generous with your time, and I really appreciate it. I look forward to.
I've been learning a lot from you. I'm making notes here, Tony.
No,
you taught me something.
I understand that there's a Japanese word. I think it's ikigai. Is that how you say it?
Ikigai.
Ikigai, which is really your sense of meaning and purpose. What is your ikigai?
Oh, wow! You end on a good one. I have a very practical one. And I have a sort of more profound one. The practical one stems from the belief that I I think that I can help figure out some problems to solve here. And I like taking, I don't mean this in a way that sounds uninspiring, but I like to tackle problems that I feel like I can solve, that I
Yes.
have an impact on. And it's not that these other problems that we deal with as a society aren't big problems, but childhood hunger to me is just an absolute travesty. I just will never understand it. I went to Somalia a couple of times and I covered the famine in Somalia. And that was probably, I've covered wars, natural disasters, all kinds of things. That was probably the worst story and the hardest story I've ever covered. Hundreds of thousands of children starving to death, starving. I mean, we are going to figure out these amazing things and we're going to come up with ways to deproliferate nuclear weapons and deal with climate change, hopefully, and these things. Children should not starve to death. And I know I'm preaching to, I don't mean to sound preachy, but it really was just so, like, that's something we could solve. Drought resistant crops, figuring out anticipating what the climate's going to be like in these areas, pre-positioning food. There's no reason that shouldn't have happened. And without any major breakthrough of any sort, or even a lot of money for that matter, we could absolutely solve that problem everywhere in the world, I think the statistic is, I don't want to get it wrong, but I think about 1 in 6 children in the United States wake up food insecure.
That's right.
That's crazy. Like, come on. That's when we can solve. Tony, you and I could solve this problem. Children would not be hungry again if we actually decided, so that's a big ikigai for me. And I think the other one is sort of more general, which is that going back to the very beginning of this discussion, I don't want to be the guy that was running in place while I was here on earth. I don't want to just run in place. I feel like it's an unbelievable gift we've been given on this Goldilocks planet. I have my parents to thank for instilling some incredible values in me. I am lucky to I think reasonably good judgment and be curious about the world. And I want to just experience it fully. I don't want to sound Pollyannish that I'm going to solve all the world's problems, but I think it's a great crime to not fully appreciate this gift we've been given. And does that mean having a lot of fun? Yeah. Does it mean doing important work? Yeah. All those things together.
That's beautiful. Well, listen, I share your values. I know you know, and I'm going to donate 100,000 meals in your name just out of this conversation today to Feeding America in your name today. I'm going to do that just as an additional. I do a lot there anyway. Wow. We feed 100 million people a year there because I'm looking to create those solutions. I created an X Prize that I'm doing in partnership with Mohammed bin Zayed, the MBZ from His Highness from the UAE, $20 million prize to feed the next billion people worldwide and bringing some of the smartest minds together for that. So we're aligned with that, but I want to make that little donation in your name just as a token of my appreciation for your time and your energy and for what a beautiful soul you are. Sanjay, everyone here can experience who you are. It's not just blowing smoke. You're an incredibly humble man. Your parents should be honored and you should be honored. I know they played a role in it, but then you've made your own choices along the way. You're a gift to us because you're always looking for solutions, and you're a gift to us because of that same vulnerability and that same depth of caring that I hope, all healers, all those in medicine or any form of healing will model if they haven't already by your example. I love you dearly, my friend. And everyone, please go out and pick up, keep sharp, right? It'll change your life and it'll help somebody maybe that you love as well. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, thank you for your time, brother.
Mr. Tony Robbins, I love you like a brother. Thank you for your time.
Blessings to you.
You too.